In the spring of 1834, in the quiet farmlands of Virginia, a sheriff forced open a cellar door that had been locked for over 20 years. What he found inside changed American history forever. 47 children, shackled, starving, silent, and yet what truly haunts us isn't just their suffering. It's the terrifying truth about the woman they called Mother Sullivan and the powerful network that helped her hide in plain sight. April 8, 1834, the sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet fields of Henry County, Virginia, when Sheriff Benjamin Crawford dismounted his horse at the edge of the Sullivan property. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs. He tightened his coat against the morning chill, but it wasn't the weather that made his hands tremble. It was the unease that had been building since the first complaint. For weeks, the rumors had spread like a creeping fog. Strange noises at night, the sight of frightened children who never spoke. A cellar door chained shut, like it guarded something the world wasn't meant to see. He had brushed it off as gossip at first, but this morning would prove that some whispers carry the weight of truth. Beside him, Deputy Marcus Webb, younger but already hardened by years of rough law enforcement, surveyed the farmhouse with narrowed eyes. It was unremarkable at first glance. A modest two-story home with white painted siding, the wraparound porch sagging slightly with age, the barn, the chicken coop, the smokehouse. It was the picture of rural normalcy. But Crawford knew better. Normalcy was a mask, and masks exist to hide what's beneath. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door. A woman in her mid-40s, with neatly pinned hair and a face that might have been kindly under different circumstances. She smiled, offered coffee, and asked in that soft, measured tone if they were here about the ugly rumors going around town. But there was something behind her eyes, something restless. She gave them the same story she'd given others. The children she and Ezra were caring for were orphans, sickly, traumatized, needing time to heal. They were asleep, she said. Best not to disturb them. But then Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. Walking around the side of the house, he saw it. The cellar door, heavy chains, 3 padlocks, wood scarred with deep scratches, like fingernails dragging for freedom. He froze. Every instinct screamed that something unspeakable was behind it. When he returned, his face was pale, his jaw tight. He leaned in close to the sheriff and whispered what he'd seen. Crawford's chest tightened. They exchanged no more words. They didn't need to. The change in her demeanor was instant. The smile fell. Her hands trembled. She stammered about safety hazards, about old equipment, about illness, anything to keep them away from that door. Bizarre. And then they heard it. A sound from beneath their feet. It was faint at first, muffled, but unmistakable. The soft, broken crying of a child, followed by another voice, barely more than a whisper, calling for help. The room went still. Crawford drew his pistol. "Open it," he demanded. "Eve." When she refused, Webb moved. The 2 men stormed the side of the house, forcing the locks one by one. The chains clattered to the ground with the final strike of a crowbar. "Davy." Crawford pushed the door open. The smell hit first. A nauseating wave of human waste, sickness, and something else. Something worse. The smell of despair. It poured from the darkness like a living thing. As Webb gagged, Crawford steadied himself. They lit their lanterns and stepped inside. The steps creaked under their boots as they descended into the earth. The cellar stretched farther than expected, swallowing them in blackness. The air grew heavier with every step, and then the light caught something silent, shackled, starving. Some were curled in corners too weak to move. Others sat upright, their faces blank, their bodies covered in sores and rags. The youngest couldn't have been older than 6. The oldest, maybe 16. They just stared, as if rescue was something they couldn't believe in anymore. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, stumbled back up the stairs to vomit in the grass. Crawford stayed frozen in place, his mind unable to process the sheer scale of what he was seeing. This was calculated, systematic. And this was only the beginning. Because as horrifying as this scene was, they hadn't yet uncovered the full truth of the Sullivan farm. How had this gone unnoticed? For over 2 decades, the answer would take them back to the beginning, to a farm that seemed like a sanctuary. Millbrook, Virginia, 1834. To understand the horror that Sheriff Crawford would eventually uncover, we must first step back into the quiet rhythm of this rural community. A place where life was measured by the season, where neighbors trusted one another, and where appearances mattered more than truths buried out of sight. Millbrook was the kind of town that barely made it onto a map. 50 or so families scattered across rolling fields, their homes built of timber and hope, connected by dusty roads and the occasional Sunday sermon. Most here farmed tobacco or corn. They traded goods at Henderson's general store, gathered in the single-room schoolhouse for community meetings, and leaned on one another when times were hard. And at the edge of this unremarkable settlement stood the Sullivan property. 200 acres of good land, a modest 2-story farmhouse painted in clean white clapboard. A wraparound porch, where on quiet evenings you might see a woman with dark hair and a soft smile, reading scripture as the sun dipped below the trees. To anyone passing by, it was a picture of grace and decency. That woman was Constance Sullivan. She arrived in Millbrook in 1811, a 22-year-old bride with Pennsylvania roots and a voice as gentle as spring rain. Neighbors described her as a woman of quiet dignity, modestly dressed, unfailingly polite, always ready with a kind word for those who needed it. She and her husband Ezra didn't join in much of the socializing, but when they did, they brought baskets of food for church gatherings and coins for charitable collections. Constance had a way of disarming people with her explanation. When someone asked about the children occasionally glimpsed in their wagon, small wide-eyed faces that never spoke, she always had the same answer. They're orphans, poor little souls from my extended family up north. We're just keeping them until we can find them good homes. People wanted to believe her. Mrs. Henderson at the general store remembered seeing those children peering from behind the wagon's canvas, silent, pale. Constance would soothe her concerns with a practiced story. They've been through so much, they're still adjusting. Every 2 weeks, Constance arrived at that store with a long list: flour, cornmeal, molasses, pork, salt, always in amounts that made people wonder, why so much for a childless couple? When pressed, Constance would chuckle softly, remind them of the orphans in her care, and pay in cash. She was equally careful with the church. Reverend Samuel Matthews often praised the Sullivans from the pulpit, calling them true Christians, caring for the least among us. Constance attended services when her health allowed, always with a somber nod when the Reverend spoke of compassion for the poor. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician, visited the farm more than once. Each time, Constance met him at the door. The children, she explained, were too frightened of strangers to be examined directly. Could he just provide the medicines she requested? She knew their symptoms well, she said. The deception was meticulous. For over 2 decades, the Sullivans managed to project an image of quiet charity. They were the kind of people communities like Millbrook revered: pious, hard-working, and self-sacrificing. But if anyone had looked closely, truly closely, cracks were there. Why were the Sullivan children never seen in town? except as fleeting shadows in a wagon. Why did Ezra work through the night, hammering and digging long after the other farmers had gone to bed? Why did the smell of burning lime sometimes drift from the property at odd hours? No one wanted to ask. Because the Sullivans were kind. Because kindness, in a place like Millbrook, was a shield. But shields can crack, and soon the first fracture would appear. Brought on by something no one could control, a single snowstorm, and it would change everything. February 23, 1834. A storm had swallowed Virginia whole. The snow fell sideways in sheets, carried by a wind that howled like a living thing through the bare branches of the trees. Travelers knew better than to be on the road that night. But Jacob Stern, a merchant hauling his cart of dry goods from Richmond toward Charlottesville, hadn't been given much choice. He'd miscalculated the weather, leaving too late in the day. Now he was paying for it. The road had vanished under a thick, blinding carpet of white. His horse stumbled with every step, nostrils flaring steam into the bitter air. His gloves were soaked, his face raw from the wind, and then through the veil of snow he saw it. A farmhouse, a faint flickering light in the window. The Sullivan property. He'd passed it before in better weather. It always seemed quiet, even a little cold. But tonight it looked like salvation. Jacob pulled into the yard, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he tied his horse to the porch post. He knocked, hesitant at first, then harder. The door opened. Constance Sullivan stood there, a candle in hand, her features bathed in warm light. She wore a simple dress, her dark hair tied back neatly, and that soft, even voice welcomed him in. "You poor man," she said. "Come inside before you freeze." Inside, the house was plain but tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth. She offered him a simple meal, cornbread and salt pork. They sat in awkward silence as he ate. Jacob couldn't help but notice how tense she seemed. Her eyes kept darting to the floor, as though she was listening for something. "Do you live here alone?" he asked. "My husband and I," she replied quickly. "And some children, orphans. They're sleeping now." Jacob nodded, trying to ease the tension. But as the night stretched on, the unease grew heavier, and then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, a faint, almost inaudible sound beneath the creak of the old house. But no, this wasn't the wind. It was crying, soft, muffled, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has no strength left to scream. Jacob froze, spoon hovering over his bowl. "What's that sound?" he asked. Constance didn't flinch. "The wind," she said. "This old house carries noises through the walls." But Jacob wasn't convinced. The crying continued, rising just enough for him to hear words, or what might have been words, choked by exhaustion. A small, weak voice beneath his feet, and then silence. Jacob didn't sleep much that night. He lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor, staring at the ceiling, listening. The crying didn't return, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was down there trapped beneath the floorboards. When dawn came, he left quickly, thanking Constance for her hospitality. But as he rode away, he couldn't stop replaying the sound in his mind. He would later describe the night as uncomfortably tense. That's all he ever said, and Jacob Stern, like so many others, kept his suspicions to himself. 3 weeks later, another traveler would not be so lucky. Her name was Mary Catherine Flynn, 17 years old, Irish. She'd come to Virginia with her family, looking for work in the tobacco fields outside Richmond. She was a bright, spirited girl, with a red scarf she wore even on the warmest days, a gift from her mother, who told her it would keep her safe in a new land. But safety was a luxury for the poor. On March 15th, during a river crossing, Mary Catherine was separated from her family. Lost, exhausted, she followed the road as the sun began to set, hoping for a farmhouse, a light in the darkness. What she found was the Sullivan property. Neighbors would later recall seeing her in town that morning, her laugh carrying through the market. But after that night, no one ever saw Mary Catherine Flynn again. Her family searched for weeks. They filed a report in Richmond. A search party combed the countryside, but the Virginia wilderness has a way of swallowing the lost whole. And as the trail went cold, her name joined a growing list of the missing. A merchant who heard whispers in the night, a girl who disappeared without a trace.
Both touched the edge of a nightmare, unaware of the monstrous design at work just beneath their feet. And yet, the final clue didn't come from a traveler or a missing girl. It came from a hunter, and what he heard could no longer be ignored. March 31st, 1834. The air was cold and clean, the kind that bit at your lungs, but carried the promise of spring. William Hutchinson, a farmer by trade and hunter by necessity, moved quietly through the woods at the edge of the Sullivan property. His musket rested against his shoulder. The underbrush crunched beneath his boots as he followed the trail of a rabbit he'd been tracking since dawn. Hutchinson wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for dinner, but trouble found him anyway. At first he thought it was an animal. A high-pitched sound, thin and wavering, carried on the wind. He froze, scanning the trees. Then he heard it again. Not an animal. Children, screaming. It wasn't playful shouting. It wasn't laughter. It was raw, unfiltered terror. The kind of sound that goes straight to the spine. Hutchinson crouched low, heart pounding. The sound came from the Sullivan house. He crept closer, moving silently through the trees, until he had a clear view of the farmhouse. From this distance the place looked ordinary. Smoke curling from the chimney, fields bare and waiting for spring planting. But the sounds from beneath that house told a different story. He stayed there for nearly an hour, listening. The screaming came in waves, sometimes shrill and panicked, sometimes reduced to soft, pitiful sobbing. And then, movement. Hutchinson's breath caught in his throat as he saw a figure emerge from a cellar door on the side of the house. Ezra Sullivan. He stepped into the morning light, glancing nervously toward the tray line, as if making sure no one was watching. He adjusted the chains that secured the door, then disappeared back underground. The screaming stopped. Hutchinson didn't move, couldn't move. He stayed frozen until the quiet became unbearable. Then slowly he turned and slipped back into the woods, his rabbit hunt long forgotten. As he walked home, his mind churned. What had he heard? What had he seen? There were rumors, of course. Everyone in Millbrook had whispered about the Sullivans at some point. The strange hours they kept, the children no one ever saw outside their wagon, the way Constance deflected questions with that soft, soothing voice. But whispers were one thing. This was different. This was a nightmare hiding in plain sight. That night, Hutchinson couldn't sleep. He thought of those voices, pleading, begging, and of Ezra vanishing back into the earth, like a man tending to secrets too dark for daylight. Would you speak up? That was the question clawing at him. Would you accuse your neighbor, a man you'd known for years, of the unthinkable? Hutchinson knew the risks. In a community like Millbrook, reputation was everything. To accuse the Sullivans without proof would mean becoming an outcast, maybe worse. And yet, those screams wouldn't leave him. The next morning he went to Thomas Henderson, the general store owner, and told him everything. Henderson listened but shook his head. You must have misheard, he said. You know Constance, she takes in troubled orphans. Kids cry. But even Henderson's voice wavered, because deep down he knew those rumors had always carried a little too much weight to dismiss outright. Hutchinson didn't stop there. He told other neighbors. Some shared his unease, others scoffed. Constance is a saint, they said. Ezra's odd, sure, but dangerous. In Millbrook, denial was easy. It was safer than imagining that evil could live just across the field. But William Hutchinson couldn't deny what he'd heard, and soon neither could anyone else. One sheriff decided to take that risk, and what he found still haunts law enforcement to this day. April 8th, the morning light had barely begun to stretch across the barren fields when Sheriff Benjamin Crawford stepped off his horse and onto the Sullivan property. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cold earth, the smell of dew mixing with the faint, acrid smoke of last night's fire. Beside him, Deputy Marcus Webb scanned the grounds, his fingers twitching nervously at the grip of his pistol. The farmhouse looked deceptively peaceful. Clapboard walls freshly whitewashed, a curl of smoke from the chimney, a rocking chair swaying gently on the porch, as if rocked by the morning breeze. But to Crawford, it felt like a mask, and masks, he knew, only exist to hide what's beneath. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door. She looked every bit the picture of rural decency, hair neatly pinned, apron tied at the waist, hands clasped gently as though in prayer. Her voice was soft, apologetic even, as she ushered them inside. "You must forgive the rumors, Sheriff," she said. "People love to talk in small towns. I assure you, everything in this house is as it should be." But her hands trembled. Inside the house was sparse but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth. A Bible lay open on a small wooden table, and the faint smell of herbs lingered in the air. On the surface, it was unremarkable, even comforting, but beneath it all was a tension so thick, it clung to the wall. Crawford let her speak, let her repeat her well-rehearsed lines about the orphans, poor little souls, she called them, traumatized and ill. He nodded, feigned understanding, all while feeling Webb's eyes on him, silently urging him to act. And then Webb spoke up. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "may I use the privy?" She hesitated. For the first time her mask cracked. Webb didn't wait for an answer. He stepped outside, circling the house, and that's when he saw it. The cellar door. It wasn't like the ones he'd seen on other farms. This one was fortified. Heavy planks reinforced with iron bands, secured by 3 massive padlocks. Chains crisscrossed the handles. The wood around them splintered and scarred with deep, desperate gouges. Webb froze, his stomach churning. Those weren't marks from tools. They were claw marks. He returned to the house, his face ashen, his jaw set tight. He leaned close to Crawford and whispered what he'd seen. Crawford's heart pounded in his chest. He'd heard the rumors. But this was no rumor. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said evenly, "we'll need to see the cellar." The color drained from her face. Her hands, once so steady in their folded poise, began to shake violently. She stammered excuses. "It's dangerous down there. It's only old storage. The children aren't allowed in that part of the house." And then they heard it. A sound, faint at first, so soft, it could have been mistaken for the wind. But then it grew clearer. The muffled sob of a child. Crawford's stomach dropped. "Open it," he demanded, his voice cold, commanding. When she refused, Webb didn't wait. He grabbed the crowbar from his saddlebag, stormed to the side of the house, and drove it between the chains. One by one, the locks snapped open under the force of their combined effort. The metal clanged against the steps like the tolling of a funeral bell, and then Crawford pushed the door open. The smell hit first. It wasn't the smell of simple neglect. It was rot, human waste, sweat, sickness, and something else. Something heavier, something Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. He gagged but steadied himself, pulling a lantern from his bag. "Stay close," he said. The wooden steps creaked. As they descended, the air grew colder, damper. The light barely cut through the suffocating blackness. And then, the walls appeared, not rough-hewn dirt, like a typical root cellar. These were stone, carefully mortared, stretching far beyond the footprint of the house. Someone had built this space deliberately, expanded it over years. Crawford's lantern flickered across the floor, and that's when they saw them. Dozens of them, thick, iron shackles, bolted into the stone walls, each one ending in a length of chain, barely long enough to move within a few feet. And then, the eyes, 47 pairs of them staring back from the shadows. Children, silent, shackled, starved. Some were curled in corners, their knees pulled tight to their chests. Others sat motionless, their heads hanging, their bodies covered in sores, their rags clinging to skeletal frames. The youngest couldn't have been older than 6. The oldest, maybe 16. Not one spoke, not one begged for help. They just stared, as if rescue was a foreign concept they no longer believed in. Webb, a father of 4, stumbled back up the stairs, retching violently into the grass outside. Crawford stayed, frozen. His mind reeled. This wasn't just cruelty. This was something far worse, something systematic. He forced himself to move, to take in every detail. The main chamber was massive, stretching into the darkness, but there were other rooms too. To the left, a smaller space lined with wooden stocks and crude restraints, punishment devices. To the right, a room with makeshift cots, jars of herbs, and rusted medical tools. A primitive infirmary. Whoever kept these children alive wasn't doing it out of mercy. It was survival management. And then there were the records, stacks of papers, names, ages, dates, cold, clinical notes, scrawled in Constance's careful hand. She hadn't just imprisoned these children, she had catalogued them. Crawford's throat tightened as he read one entry aloud. Female. 9. Weak. Compliant. Needs conditioning. These weren't children to the Sullivans, they were inventory. He turned back toward the silent mass of hollow faces. You're safe now, he said, his voice cracking, but the words felt meaningless. The children didn't react. They'd been here too long, suffering too deeply. Webb returned, pale, but resolute. We need help, he said. Crawford nodded. They'd found the nightmare at the heart of Millbrook, but as horrifying as this discovery was, it wasn't the whole story, not by far, because the basement wasn't just a prison, it was a grave. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford thought he had seen the worst of it. The chains, the shackled children, the silent, hollow faces, staring back at him from the shadows, but he hadn't, not yet, lantern in hand. He pressed deeper into the labyrinth beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. Every step took him farther from daylight, deeper into the blackened heart of whatever Constance and Ezra had built here. The floor was damp, the stones slick beneath his boots. He could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, an unsettling rhythm that only amplified the oppressive silence of the basement. To his left, Deputy Marcus Webb followed closely, his breathing shallow, as if afraid to disturb the heavy stillness that hung in the air. This place, Webb whispered, his voice breaking. This place isn't a cellar. It's a dungeon. He wasn't wrong.
And dungeons hold more than just prisoners. The main chamber, where the children had been found, wasn't the end of it. Beyond it, narrow passageways led to other rooms. The first one they entered made Crawford's stomach twist. It was little more than a closet, but its walls were lined with wooden stocks, crudely constructed shackles, and whips worn down from use. The floor bore deep stains, dark patches that the sheriff refused to think too hard about. A punishment room. These weren't just tools of discipline, they were tools of control. Crawford pulled his lantern closer, illuminating the walls. Scratched into the wood, almost too faint to see, were marks, dozens of them, short vertical lines grouped in fives, like a prisoner's tally. Someone had been keeping count of what? Days, beatings, or worse. The next room was bigger. This one had been outfitted like some crude infirmary. Rusted medical tools, cracked glass jars, filled with unidentifiable liquids, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, their smell mixing with the stench of rot. And then there were the cots, rough wooden frames draped with filthy rags, each one stained with blood and pus. This was where the sick were brought. Crawford realized, where Ezra or Constance had patched them up just enough to keep them alive. This wasn't care. It was maintenance, like livestock. But it was the final chamber that froze Crawford in his tracks. It was smaller than the others, low-ceilinged, the air colder, heavier. Webb raised his lantern and immediately stepped back, gagging. "Oh God," he choked out. Crawford forced himself to look. The walls of this chamber were different, rougher, the floor uneven. And then he saw why. The mounds, half a dozen of them at first glance, then more, dozens. Shallow graves. They were everywhere. Some disturbed recently, others packed so tightly the soil had hardened over time. Crawford knelt, his knees pressing into the damp earth. He brushed away the top layer of soil from one of the mounds, his fingers trembling. A small hand, pale, boneless in its stillness. The stench of lime burned his nostrils. It had been used to mask the smell of death. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. On a small table in the corner they found the ledgers. Crawford flipped through them with shaking hands, page after page. Names, ages, dates of arrival, cold clinical notes in Constance Sullivan's neat handwriting. Male, 7. Strong, defiant, female. 10. Compliant, quiet, female. 5. Frail, likely short-term. And then toward the back, the words that made his blood run cold: transferred, deceased. Dozens of entries. The ledgers detailed more than 90 children. 90, but there were only 47 in the basement when they arrived. Webb slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. "Where are they, Sheriff?" he demanded. "Where are the others?" It was the question neither of them wanted to ask. The graves in this room answered some of it, but not all. There were still so many unaccounted for. Crawford felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't just a house of horrors. This was a system, a machine, and the Sullivans had been operating it for over 2 decades without anyone noticing. He looked back toward the door, toward the narrow passage that led to daylight. "We need help," he said, his voice low, determined. Webb nodded, though his face had gone pale. The 2 men stood in silence, staring at the graves. It wasn't just the horror of what they'd found, it was the horror of knowing this was only part of the story. Because if 90 children had passed through this place, where had the rest gone? Crawford didn't know it yet. But the answer to that question didn't lie in the graves. It lay in the record, in the coded correspondence they would soon uncover. Letters that revealed a network far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford thought he had seen the worst of it. The chains, the shackled children, the silent, hollow faces staring back at him from the shadow, but he hadn't. Not yet. Lantern in hand, he pressed deeper into the labyrinth beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. Every step took him farther from daylight, deeper into the blackened heart of whatever Constance and Ezra had built here. The floor was damp, the stones slick beneath his boots. He could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, an unsettling rhythm that only amplified the oppressive silence of the basement. To his left, Deputy Marcus Webb followed closely, his breathing shallow, as if afraid to disturb the heavy stillness that hung in the air. "This place," Webb whispered, his voice breaking. "This place isn't a cellar. It's a dungeon." He wasn't wrong. And dungeons hold more than just prisoners. The main chamber, where the children had been found, wasn't the end of it. Beyond it, narrow passageways led to other rooms. The first one they entered made Crawford's stomach twist. It was little more than a closet, but its walls were lined with wooden stocks, crudely constructed shackles, and whips worn down from use. The floor bore deep stains, dark patches that the sheriff refused to think too hard about. A punishment room. These weren't just tools of discipline, they were tools of control. Crawford pulled his lantern closer, illuminating the walls. Scratched into the wood, almost too faint to see, were marks. Dozens of them, short, vertical lines grouped in 5s, like a prisoner's tally. Someone had been keeping count. Of what? Days, beatings, or worse. The next room was bigger. This one had been outfitted like some crude infirmary. Rusted medical tools, cracked glass jars filled with unidentifiable liquid, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, their smell mixing with the stench of rot. And then there were the cots, rough wooden frames, draped with filthy rags, each one stained with blood and pus. This was where the sick were brought. Crawford realized, where Ezra or Constance had patched them up just enough to keep them alive. This wasn't care. It was maintenance. Like livestock. But it was the final chamber that froze Crawford in his tracks. It was smaller than the others, low-ceilinged, the air colder, heavy.
Webb raised his lantern and immediately stepped back, gagging. "Oh God," he choked out. Crawford forced himself to look. The walls of this chamber were different, rougher, the floor uneven, and then he saw why. The mounds, half a dozen of them at first glance, then more, dozen, shallow graves. They were everywhere, some disturbed recently, others packed so tightly the soil had hardened over time. Crawford knelt, his knees pressing into the damp earth. He brushed away the top layer of soil from one of the mounds, his fingers trembling, a small hand, pale, boneless in its stillness. The stench of lime burned his nostrils. It had been used to mask the smell of death. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. On a small table in the corner they found the ledgers. Crawford flipped through them with shaking hands, page after page. Names, age, dates of arrival. Cold, clinical notes in Constance Sullivan's neat handwriting. Male, 7, strong, defiant. Female, 10, compliant, quiet. Female, 5, frail, likely short term. And then toward the back the words that made his blood run cold. Transferred, dozens of entries. The ledgers detailed more than 90 children. 90. But there were only 47 in the basement when they arrived. Webb slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. "Where are they, Sheriff?" he demanded. "Where are the others?" It was the question neither of them wanted to ask. The graves in this room answered some of it, but not all. There were still so many unaccounted for. Crawford felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't just a house of horrors. This was a system, a machine, and the Sullivans had been operating it for over 2 decades without anyone noticing. He looked back toward the door, toward the narrow passage that led to daylight. "We need help," he said, his voice low, determined. Webb nodded, though his face had gone pale. The 2 men stood in silence, staring at the graves. It wasn't just the horror of what they'd found. It was the horror of knowing this was only part of the story. Because if 90 children had passed through this place, where had the rest gone? Crawford didn't know it yet. But the answer to that question didn't lie in the graves. It lay in the records, in the coded correspondence they would soon uncover. Letters that revealed a network far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The Sullivan basement was no longer just a crime scene. It was evidence. Evidence of something far larger, darker, and more organized than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. When Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb emerged from that underground nightmare, the daylight felt alien, almost offensive, compared to the darkness they had left behind. But there was no time for shock. They needed help. Within hours, Crawford had summoned additional deputies and locked down the property, and as investigators combed through every inch of the farmhouse, they found the documents that would blow the entire case wide open. They weren't just legends, they were letters. At first glance, they looked like ordinary correspondence, receipts, purchase orders, innocuous exchanges between distant acquaintances. But as Crawford read further, his blood ran cold. This wasn't the language of family business. It was code. Phrases like items of varying quality, deliveries secured, and conditioning required appeared again and again. The children weren't children in these letters. They were merchandise. The Sullivans hadn't been acting alone. Among the documents was a packet of letters, neatly tied with twine, each bearing the same signature, Blackwood. One letter, dated just weeks before the basement was discovered, chilled Crawford to his core. "We are in need of 6 units, ages between 8 and 12, healthy, able-bodied, of compliant temperament. Condition must be serviceable. Payment will be rendered upon verification of quality. No names, no humanity, just cold, transactional language." Blackwood wasn't some phantom figure. Further investigation revealed him to be Henry Blackwood, a wealthy plantation owner in South Carolina. a man whose name carried weight in the political and economic circles of the South. And he wasn't alone. In letter after letter, different names emerged. Morrison of Philadelphia, a man referred to only as J.D., from Georgia, a correspondent in Charleston, who signed his letters with the initials W.P., all of them using similar language, all of them discussing units, shipments, and conditioning. This wasn't charity. This was a network. As federal marshals were brought in to assist with the case, they began decoding the language. What they uncovered painted a horrifying picture. Constance Sullivan hadn't been simply kidnapping children. She had been procuring. Some were purchased from corrupt officials at orphanages and poorhouses. Others were kidnapped from the streets, runaways, the poor, the forgotten, and some investigators discovered had been sold to the Sullivans by their own desperate families for a handful of coin. The letters revealed a system that operated across state lines: Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas. Each unit was tracked, catalogued, and either kept, transferred, or sold. And the Sullivans' farm, it was more than a holding place. It was a distribution hub. The most disturbing discovery was that this network wasn't limited to a handful of depraved individuals. It was fueled by wealth and power. Henry Blackwood, for example, was no common criminal. He was a respected landowner with political connections in Charleston. Records indicated that he had been purchasing children from the Sullivans for years. Other names that surfaced were equally untouchable: men with plantations, businesses, even seats in state legislatures. It was trafficking, but of a kind rarely spoken of in history books. These children weren't enslaved in the traditional sense. They were property in the shadow market, a disposable underclass, used for labor, experiments, or worse, with no legal recognition or protection. One federal marshal described the operation as a system designed to erase children. Even more chilling were the records Constance kept about the conditioning process. In the margins of the ledgers, she had written notes about how to control the children: compliant when isolated, improved behavior after exposure to discipline, rewards effective for younger units. It wasn't random cruelty, it was systematic psychological breaking. To the outside world, Constance had been the soft-spoken caregiver, the charitable Christian woman rescuing orphans. But in these letters, she revealed her true face: a calculating handler, molding children into products for sale. When the news began to spread through Millbrook, disbelief quickly gave way to panic. How had they missed them? For more than 2 decades, Constance had lived among them, her husband Ezra working the fields by day, her wagon making quiet trips to town for supplies, her voice disarming and humble as she talked about the poor orphans in her care. Neighbors began remembering things they had ignored: the unusual amounts of food and medicine she purchased, the late-night hammering coming from the property, the way the children never spoke in public. It wasn't just the Sullivans who were complicit, it was the silence of a whole community that had allowed them to operate in plain sight. But if Millbrook was shocked, the greater public was horrified. Newspapers carried the story of the Sullivan basement, but what kept readers awake at night wasn't just the image of 47 children in chains. It was the question: if this was happening here, how many other places like it exist? The investigation into the Sullivan network grew quickly. Federal authorities raided orphanages suspected of selling children. They interrogated poorhouse officials across multiple states. They followed the trail of names in Constance's letters, uncovering a web of criminal activity so vast, it seemed impossible that it had gone unnoticed for so long. And yet one thing remained unclear: why did so many children disappear from the ledgers without explanation? Transferred, Constance had written in her neat, looping script. Transferred where? Crawford had no answers. Not yet, but he would soon, because buried in that stack of letters was one piece of correspondence that pointed directly to the heart of the operation, a name that would drag this investigation into even deeper darkness. And when that name came to light, It revealed that the Sullivans were just one small part of a network far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Her name was Rebecca. She was 14 years old when federal marshals began interviewing the rescued children. Most of them barely spoke at all. They had been broken down by years of captivity, too frightened, too conditioned to answer questions. But Rebecca was different. She had a spark, a defiance that hadn't been completely extinguished. And with that defiance came something investigators desperately needed: memory. Rebecca had been in the Sullivan basement longer than most, nearly 5 years. She still remembered life before captivity, her family's farm in rural Pennsylvania, her little brother's laugh, the way her mother sang while kneading bread. Those memories became her armor. She held on to them like a lifeline, refusing to let Constance Sullivan erase who she was. She told the investigators everything. Rebecca had been taken in 1820. A woman had arrived at their farm, soft-spoken and kind, claiming to be a distant relative who wanted to help the family through hard times. She offered Rebecca a ride to town and promised sweets from the market, but instead of candy, Rebecca woke up in chains beneath the Sullivans' house. In her testimony, she described the basement in haunting detail, the way the children were kept separated to prevent them from forming bonds, the strict routines, the punishments that kept them compliant. She spoke of the conditioning, a word she'd overheard Constance use many times. New arrivals were broken down with isolation, starvation, and beatings until they stopped fighting. Those who resisted were made examples of in the punishment room. But what made Rebecca's account invaluable wasn't just her memories of the basement, it was what she overheard. Rebecca had been chosen more than once to help in small tasks, above ground, cleaning dishes, running errands under Constance's supervision, and she listened. She listened when visitors came to the house, men in fine clothes who didn't look like farmers, men who examined children like cattle at a market, men who discussed orders and specifications as if they were shopping for goods. She remembered names: Henry Blackwood, Morrison, a man called J.D. from Georgia. She remembered snippets of conversation: Blackwood demanding healthy stock and units capable of work, Morrison writing letters about 6 deliveries by spring, J.D. complaining that the last shipment had been damaged goods. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the Sullivans weren't just holding children, they were moving them, selling them, trading them like property. She told investigators about the wagons that came in the dead of night, taking children away. She didn't know where they went, but she heard Constance tell Ezra once that the merchandise is going farther south. Rebecca also remembered a visit from a man she never forgot, tall, well-dressed, with a gold pocket watch he kept checking as if time was money. He had inspected her closely, turning her face toward the light, checking her teeth and arms. She remembered the coldness in his eyes when he decided she wasn't suitable. He left without buying anyone that day. For the investigators, Rebecca's testimony was like a key turning in a lock. Her words confirmed what the letters had suggested. The Sullivans were just one piece of a much larger operation, but Rebecca gave them more than just facts. She gave them humanity. In her soft, steady voice, she spoke of the friendship she'd made in the basement, the little one she tried to protect, the songs she whispered at night to keep herself safe. She described the hopelessness on the faces of children who had been there longer than she had, children who no longer believed in rescue. She even described Constance, not as a monster screaming in rage, but as something colder and more terrifying, a woman who could hum a hymn while locking a child in chains. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Hardened federal marshals who had seen more than their share of horrors struggled to meet her gaze. Rebecca's courage changed everything. Her testimony gave investigators a roadmap, names to pursue, routes to investigate, connections to untangle, and in doing so, she transformed the Sullivan case from a local tragedy into the exposure of a nationwide criminal enterprise. But Rebecca's story also raised questions investigators weren't ready to answer. If the Sullivans were just a link in the chain, how big was the chain? How many more children had vanished into this network, and just how far up did it go? They didn't know it yet, but the next lead would drag them into even deeper darkness, because one name on Rebecca's lips, Henry Blackwood, wasn't just a custom. He was the doorway into a nightmare far more depraved than anyone could imagine. Henry Blackwood was a name that carried weight. In Charleston, South Carolina, it was synonymous with wealth, influence and respectability. To the unsuspecting public, he was a plantation owner, a businessman, and a patron of the arts. His sprawling estate stretched over 1,000 acres of fertile land, worked by scores of enslaved laborers. His parties were the kind that drew politicians and preachers alike. His donations to local churches and charities made here in the newspapers in glowing terms. But beneath that carefully polished image, Henry Blackwood was hiding a darkness, even deeper than Constance Sullivan. It was Rebecca who first gave investigators the key to unlocking that darkness. Her testimony had been clear. Blackwood wasn't just another name on a ledger. He was one of the most regular and high-paying customers in the Sullivans' network. She recalled his visits vividly, his commanding presence, his expensive clothes, the way he looked at the children, not with pity or kindness, but with cold appraisal as though they were livestock. She remembered the sound of his voice as he discussed their condition, his dissatisfaction when one shipment didn't meet his standards. Too weak, she heard him say of a boy no older than 10, "I need strongest." Investigators quickly discovered that Rebecca's memories matched the letters Crawford had found in the Sullivan farmhouse. Henry Blackwood had written more than a dozen of them, his neat, bold handwriting detailing orders, deliveries, and payment. One letter in particular left them stunned. In it, Blackwood had described his need for youthful, obedient units of various backgrounds for experimental use. The word experimental wasn't explained, but its presence was chilling. When federal marshals arrived at the Blackwood plantation, the facade of Southern gentility quickly crumbled. At first, Blackwood denied everything. He was outraged at the suggestion that he had any connection to the Sullivans or their unsavory business. He threatened lawsuits, tried to leverage his political connections, and even attempted to bribe one of the investigators to make this whole thing disappear. But the evidence was overwhelming. The letters, the financial records, and eventually, the testimony of someone who had once worked for him, an overseer named Samuel Pierce. Pierce's account opened a door investigators hadn't even known existed. He told them that Blackwood operated two very different parts of his estate. The first was what everyone saw: the cotton fields, the enslaved laborers, the standard brutality of the Southern plantation system. But the second part, the experimental quarters, as Blackwood called them, was something far worse. Pierce described a set of outbuildings at the far edge of the property, away from the main house, where the trafficked children were kept. He said they were locked in small windowless rooms, and used for purposes that made even hardened marshals recoil. Some were trained for servitude in the Blackwood household, treated like playthings for the wealthy guests who visited his estate. Others were sent farther south to other buyers, vanishing into the same shadow network that had consumed so many before them. But the worst, Pierce claimed, were those used for medical experiments. The term sounded almost unbelievable to the investigators, but Pierce insisted it was true. He said Blackwood had ties to two physicians from Charleston Medical College, men who visited regularly to conduct what they called research. They tested the limits of starvation, disease, and trauma on these children, documenting their findings as if they were advancing science. They treated their victims like lab rats, injecting them with substances, exposing them to illnesses, and observing their suffering with cold detachment. Pierce even described one horrifying scene in which a child was restrained while a physician deliberately infected them with smallpox to see how long they could survive. The marshals were horrified, but Pierce's testimony was too detailed to dismiss as fabrication. When they raided the Blackwood estate, they found the experimental quarters exactly as he described: rows of small cells, some still containing chains, bolted to the walls, crude medical equipment stained with old blood, and ledgers that made Constance Sullivan's records look like the work of an amateur. Blackwood had documented everything. The numbers were staggering. According to his records, Blackwood had purchased at least 37 children from the Sullivans over a span of 2 decades. Of those, fewer than 5 were still alive when federal authorities arrived. The rest had either been transferred, sold to other buyers, or buried in unmarked graves on his property. The meticulousness of his bookkeeping was almost inhuman, listing each child by age, physical condition, and usefulness. One entry simply read, male, 9, uncooperative, disposed. When these findings became public, the outcry was immediate. Newspapers that had once praised Blackwood as a pillar of the Charleston community now published scathing exposés about the butcher of South Carolina. But even as the nation reacted in horror, the deeper implications of his crimes began to surface. Blackwood wasn't working alone. The letters revealed that he was in contact with at least 12 other buyers across multiple states, some of them wealthy plantation owners, others prominent businessmen. They weren't just acquiring children for labor, they were using them for entertainment, for profit, for experimentation. And if Henry Blackwood, a man so publicly respected, could be capable of such atrocities, how many others like him were hiding in plain sight? For Sheriff Crawford and the federal marshals, it was a turning point. The Sullivan case had begun as the unmasking of one depraved family in rural Virginia, but the Blackwood connection proved it was much bigger, an interlocking web of power, money and unimaginable cruelty stretching across the South and beyond. Yet even with Blackwood in custody, the marshals knew they were only scratching the surface. There were more names in those letters, more hidden estates, more experimental quarters, waiting to be uncovered. And above all, there were still children out there, children who had vanished into the network, and might never be found. As one investigator grimly noted in his report, the Sullivan case is no longer about one base. It is about an entire system of human trafficking, operating under the cover of respectability, fueled by the very people society trusts the most. But the nightmare didn't end with the Blackwood discovery. In fact, it was about to take an even darker turn, because in those letters, buried between orders and payments, was a name investigators didn't recognize, a name that would lead them to the highest levels of this shadow network. And when they uncovered who that name belonged to, it would change the entire course of the investigation, and revealed that the Sullivans and Blackwood were just the beginning. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that the Sullivan basement and the Blackwood plantation were only threads in a far larger tapestry, one woven with power, wealth and corruption. This wasn't just a trafficking ring, it was an enterprise. In the weeks following Henry Blackwood's arrest, federal marshals scoured the letters and ledgers recovered from both the Sullivan and Blackwood properties. What they uncovered was staggering. The network stretched across at least 5 states: Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, with clear evidence of contacts as far north as New York. Each letter they decoded led to another name, another location, another link in the chain. But these weren't shadowy outlaws operating in the dark. They were men of status, plantation owners, businessmen, even public officials, and that made them dangerous. One letter, signed by a J from Georgia, casually discussed an incoming shipment of 6 children, ages 9 to 13. Another, from Morrison of Philadelphia, referenced an arrangement with a poorhouse administrator to provide orphans in exchange for cash. The names weren't just customers, they were collaborators. Some were bribing orphanage directors, others were using their positions to keep law enforcement at bay. It quickly became clear that Constance Sullivan's role had been that of a handler, the one who acquired and prepared the children. Blackwood and men like him were buyers, but who was coordinating the network? That was the question that kept federal investigators up at night. One name stood out, buried in a series of letters between Blackwood and a Charleston contact, was a man referred to only as H. No surname, no address, just H. In one letter, Blackwood wrote, "H assures me the deliveries will continue without disruption. His reach extends beyond our southern circle, and he will see to it personally that replacements are procured if necessary. Who was
The marshals believed this mysterious figure was more than a buyer. He was a facilitator, a man with the resources to move children across state lines, silence witnesses, and keep the operation running, even when one of its members fell. And if that was true, it meant this network had someone at its center with influence far greater than anyone in Millbrook could comprehend. As the investigation expanded, the stakes grew higher. Sheriff Crawford, who had been hailed as a hero for uncovering the Sullivan basement, began receiving anonymous letters. They were short and to the point. "Drop this. For your own sake." One evening, a rock smashed through his window with a note attached. "You can't save them all. Stop trying." Deputy Webb, too, felt the pressure. His farm animals were slaughtered in the night. His children received threats, scrawled in crude handwriting, promising what happened to them will happen to yours. Even the federal marshals weren't immune. One reported being followed through the streets of Richmond by men in dark coats. Another awoke to find a noose hanging from the tree outside his hotel. It became clear that the people they were investigating weren't just wealthy. They were untouchable, men with deep pockets and deeper connections. The case took an even more chilling turn when Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had unknowingly supplied Constance Sullivan with medical supplies for years, came forward with a confession. He admitted that Constance often asked for unusual treatments, sedatives, painkillers, drugs to suppress appetite. He provided them without question, believing her story about caring for traumatized orphans. But now, in the light of what had been uncovered, he realized the truth. He had been complicit in keeping those children alive, just long enough for them to be sold. Whitfield gave investigators more than just guilt. He provided names. In his ledger, he had recorded shipments of medical supplies ordered on behalf of Constance, some paid for by men in Charleston and Savannah. One name appeared more than any other: Harrison P. Langford, a wealthy shipping magnate based in Savannah. Langford's name wasn't new to the marshals. He had been on their radar for years, suspected of smuggling goods along the coast. But this wasn't goods. This was human cargo. Langford, they now believed, was H. When they subpoenaed his records, their suspicions were confirmed. Langford's shipping logs revealed dozens of unlisted deliveries made to private estates across the South. He had the ships. He had the connections. He had the power to move children like they were crates of sugar or cotton, silently and invisibly. And his letters to Blackwood made one thing horrifyingly clear. He didn't just facilitate the trade, he profited from it. "The latest consignment is ready," one letter read. "Ensure payment is sent by the week's end. Failure to do so will result in termination of our agreement." This wasn't a side operation for Langford. This was a business. The exposure of Langford's involvement should have been a victory, but instead, it revealed just how untouchable the network really was. When the marshals tried to arrest him, Langford's lawyers swarmed the courthouse, producing documents, affidavits, and witnesses to paint the entire case as a misunderstanding. Local judges, many of whom were indebted to Langford, delayed warrants. Evidence mysteriously went missing. Witnesses recanted their statements after receiving visits from Langford's men. The case was unraveling before their eyes, but Crawford refused to back down. "This isn't just about the Sullivans anymore," he told the marshals. "This is about exposing every last one of them. I don't care how high up it goes." As 1834 turned to 1835, the Sullivan investigation had become something much bigger. It wasn't just a criminal case, it was a war. And in that war, the enemy had resources far beyond anything Crawford or the marshals could muster. Yet even as the network fought to protect itself,
Cracks began to show. A disgruntled employee on Langford's payroll came forward with documents that detailed payments to several prominent figures, politicians, judges, and businessmen who had all taken bribes to keep the network hidden. The corruption was deeper than anyone had feared, and the question hung over every investigator's head. If men like Langford could buy their way out of justice, how could they hope to bring this entire machine down? The answer came from an unlikely source, a man inside the network who had seen too much and was ready to talk, and his testimony would change everything. The man who walked into the federal marshal's office in Richmond on a humid July morning in 1835 did not look like a savior. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, his face weathered by years of labor and guilt. He introduced himself as Samuel Pierce, a name that investigators would come to regard as one of the most critical pieces in unraveling the Sullivan-Blackwood-Langford network. Pierce had been an overseer on Henry Blackwood's plantation for nearly a decade. He had seen everything: the deliveries that came under the cover of night, the terrified children brought in like livestock, the cruel conditioning sessions carried out in the experimental quarters, and for nearly 10 years, he had said nothing. He was part of the machine, the silent enforcer who ensured the system kept running. But something had changed. When the Sullivans were arrested and Blackwood's estate raided, Pierce knew the walls were closing in. More than that, he could no longer live with the nightmares. He confessed to the marshals that he hadn't just been a witness, he had been an accomplice. He was the one who carried children from the wagons to the holding cell. He was the one who enforced Blackwood's punishments when a child disobeyed. His voice trembled when he admitted to chaining them himself. "I can't wash their faces out of my mind," he told investigators, his voice raw. "Those kids, they didn't scream anymore after a while. They just stared, like they were already dead inside. I made them like that." The room was silent. Even the hardened federal marshals struggled to meet his eyes. But Pierce had come for more than an absolution. He had come with information, and he wanted to use it to bring the entire network down. In a series of long, grueling interviews, Pierce laid out what he knew. He gave the marshals the layout of Blackwood's estate, the schedule of deliveries, the methods used to transport children across state lines. He identified the physicians who had participated in the so-called experiments, naming 2 Charleston Medical College doctors, Nathaniel Rowe and Dr. Elias Granger, as willing participants in the torture disguised as research, and he gave them something even more valuable: names. Dozens of them. Plantation owners in Georgia who purchased children for domestic labor, a wealthy businessman in Savannah who used them as forced workers in his warehouses, a judge in North Carolina who ensured that no legal action ever touched their operation. Pierce even claimed that Langford himself boasted of having contacts in Washington, powerful men who knew about the trafficking, but turned a blind eye in exchange for political contributions. It was a bombshell. For the first time, the investigators had a detailed map of the network, not just the Sullivans, not just Blackwood, but the broader system of buyers, sellers and enablers who had allowed the trade to thrive in the shadows for decades. But perhaps the most chilling part of Pierce's testimony was his description of the auction. According to him, once or twice a year, selected buyers were invited to secret gatherings on estates like Blackwood's, where children were presented, inspected, and sold to the highest bidder. He spoke of carriages, lined up in long rows, men in fine clothes examining children as if they were cattle, and the cold, businesslike discussions of price and condition. Some of them, Pierce said, his voice breaking, didn't even look at them as people. They'd poke at them, check their teeth, their hands, their muscles, like they were buying horses. The marshals listened in stunned silence. They knew trafficking was horrific, but the scale, the organization, and the utter dehumanization Pierce described were beyond anything they had imagined. Pierce's testimony changed the trajectory of the investigation. With his help, the marshals secured warrants to raid more estates across the South. They seized ledgers, letters, and financial records that corroborated his story. They rescued more children, many too traumatized to even speak, and began piecing together the horrifying puzzle of where the missing ones had gone. But with every victory came new danger. Pierce had painted a target on his back. Within days of his confession, word spread. Blackwood's allies wanted him silenced. Langford's men reportedly offered a bounty for anyone who could make him disappear. The marshals relocated him to a safe house in Washington. But even there, he lived in constant fear. "I know they're coming for me," Pierce admitted in one interview. "They won't let me live after what I've said." And he was right. 2 weeks later, a group of armed men attempted to storm the safe house. The marshals fought them off, but the message was clear. Pierce had declared war on people who had resources, power, and no hesitation to kill. Despite the threats, his testimony was invaluable. It became the foundation for federal indictments against Langford, Blackwood, and a dozen others. But as prosecutors began building their cases, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a criminal trial, it was a political one. Many of the men named in Pierce's testimony had deep connections to lawmakers, judges, and even federal officials. Bringing them to justice would mean taking on some of the most powerful people in the country. And for Crawford, Webb, and the marshals, it raised a terrifying question. If the law was compromised by the very men they were trying to prosecute, could justice for the Sullivan children, and all the others, ever truly be served? The answer, as they would soon discover, would lead to one of the most grueling legal battles of the decade, and it would come at a devastating cost.